What is up everyone, Talon here and welcome back to Amped Airsoft. Today we're going to be looking at the PERUN HPA Trigger Boards, looking at what they're going to be capable of doing, what they're going to be compatible with, and what you can include when you add these to your HPA build. So let's get into it. So really quickly, I want to point out that we have the version 2 and version 3 style of HPA trigger boards. These are not going to be in reference to firmware. Version 2 is going to be for version 2 style of gearboxes, your M4s and AR-15s. Your version 3 is going to be for V3 style of gearboxes, most commonly seen in AK variants. That's what these guys are going to be. And these are going to be for HPA builds specifically. PERUN also makes a bunch of different MOSFETs incorporating magnets as optical sensors with AEG MOSFETs. And they have a couple different variations, some for the P90s, some for the AUG, as well as a couple other smaller variants that you guys can get access to for your AEG builds. However, here at Amped Airsoft, we do have a little bit more preference for our HPA builds. One of the ones that we did in preparation for this video is going to be this E&L AK-105, which does house the V3 HPA trigger board and also incorporates PERUN's clicker system. So every time you fire, that trigger is going to work and incorporate with their clicker system, giving you a more tactile action every time you pull the trigger. And it helps bridge that gap between airsoft and realism just a little bit. And we're happy to see a company like PERUN begin to further bridge that gap in this hobby. I want to ask you guys a question. Comment down below if you guys wanted to see any other version of an HPA trigger board. What version would you want it to be? An M14, 249, FALs? Like just spitballing, just throwing a couple things out there. What would you guys want to see PERUN do next? Comment down below. I'm really interested to see what you guys have to offer. So some of you guys might be asking, what is the point of going with the PERUN HPA trigger board? How is it really any that much different compared to some of the other options that we have available on the market? I mean, why not just stick with the original trigger board? Well, in the case of the PERUN one, it does offer a couple of additional features in conjunction to the base FCU functionality. So each HPA engine is going to offer customization to the different functions of the engine itself. The PERUN Trigger Board is going to offer additional programmability that is going to work just the trigger action itself. And that primarily is going to be done through their incorporation of the magnetic field sensors as well as the clicker system. And if you guys have any questions about the clicker system, we did a previous video that you can follow in the link up above there. But I would encourage you to stay to the end of this video before checking that one out so you have a better idea what this does in conjunction with that. Some additional controls that the PERUN HPA trigger board is going to give you in conjunction with the trigger action is going to be changing your fire modes. So that does happen on the FCU, but in the case of PERUN, they offer you a couple others. You do have the option, if you wanted to change maybe your semi-auto position, you do have the option of making it semi-auto, binary, as well as a 2-stage trigger, which is very, very cool. I personally don't know of any FCUs out of the box from the factory that would allow that type of programmability. That's typically something that you have to incorporate an aftermarket board in order to have that customization, hence the aftermarket board. You also have options for changing the trigger sensitivity. So in the case of utilizing a magnetic field on the top of the trigger, it can register the smallest movement, a fraction of a millimeter of movement that the trigger is going to move, which does allow a better change and alteration to your build if you want to do something that was a little bit more high speed. And that is something that you can also incorporate with some of the clicker systems. This also is going to allow for DMR shooting as well. So you do have options of firing a shot within one shot within a quarter of a second, half a second, 3/4 of a second, 1 second, 2 seconds, which is going to better emulate for DMR type of rifles the rate of fire that you would most typically associate with that role. And that is something that is very, very cool. Again, something that usually takes an aftermarket option. You also have the option to do a master reset that is going to change just the board and not the FCU. So if you go super in depth with changing some of these options and you stray further and further away from what you want to go, you do have the option of just resetting all of those functions and going back to scratch. The trigger board by itself is, while it does look very busy, it is also the most minimalist option. I am going to do an installation video towards the end of this video demonstrating how to do an installation of this into a gearbox, but I also talk about and want to point out in this portion of the video that there's actually no option for incorporating the trigger with engaging a micro switch. And the exact same thing occurs on the very back of the board as well, where you would typically see a little switch that the selector plate would engage to go from semi to full auto. That does not exist. Instead, they're utilizing a magnet that would attach to the selector plate that would wave, over the back of the HPA trigger board that tells the system what selector position you are in. And the same thing works for your trigger. So whenever there's a little magnet on the top of that trigger, it would wave over some of the sensors and registers when that trigger is pulled and when to initiate that shot. So because there's no additional contact to the board, that means you technically have a board that has an infinite lifetime. As long as you're not messing with the electronics and the power sources, this could last a very, very, very long time. And not only that, but PERUN, for most of their boards, is going to be weather and water resistant. Now, we have not been able to do a full in-depth testing of this functionality. It is something that I would very much like to do, but PERUN being based in Poland and seeing a lot of snow and rain, seeing a couple of players as well dump snow into their airsoft replica and into their gearbox to prove some of the weather resistant functionality of the board. This is going to work in inclement weather, and I'm very confident with that as well. I've been very happy with some of the things that PERUN has been showing us. Not only that, but it allows the best customization of SpeedSoft and MilSim functionality. So regardless of what you want to set up, in the case of our E&L AK105, this is going to be a little bit more of a MilSim type of setup. And we have another one off camera I wanted to quick grab that is going to be a little bit more SpeedSoft-esque. That does also incorporate the PERUN system as well as the clicker. So we were able to get this a little bit more indoor based. So let's talk about some of the compatibility of the PERUN HPA trigger boards. In the case of the version 2 style of HPA trigger board, the list of compatibility for the gearbox profile is very, very, very long. It would actually kind of be a shorter list if you incorporated the gearboxes it is not compatible in. So in the case of the majority of the airsoft market, this is going to work and fit in there without any type of issues. The same thing can be said about the V3 gearbox as well. Most of our standard off-the-wall AK variants are going to be compatible with the V3 HPA trigger board and should have no issues whatsoever. I do know that when it comes to the V3 gearboxes, there are some very specific cuts and profiles of the gearboxes. So PERUN has done their research and they have a list on their manual that denotes what alterations or what modifications would have to occur to the gearbox to get the trigger board to fit. So PERUN has done their research. And then as far as the HPA systems that are compatible, because we're incorporating an electronic system into our trigger boards, we do need something that is going to work off of an FCU. So unfortunately, this list is going to be relatively short. In the case of no particular order, we're going to talk about PolarStar. PolarStar, the Jack, F1, and F2 are going to be compatible with the HPA trigger board from PERUN. The Kythera, for obvious reasons, because there is no FCU or electronics, is not going to be compatible. The Fusion engine is also not going to be compatible because the Fusion engine replaces the gearbox, and so there's no place to put the trigger board that goes into a gearbox into a system that doesn't use the gearbox. Get me? Then we're going to talk about Wolverine. In the case of Wolverine, the Hydra, Reaper, the premium electronics, the Inferno premium electronics, not the Spartan electronics. If you're using the Spartan board, it is not going to be compatible. You do need an FCU, like a separate FCU, like the Hydra, the Reaper premium FCU, and the Inferno Premium FCU are going to be incorporating. So those guys are going to be what works and has been tested to work. If you want to look at Redline that we have here in our E&L AK105, you can only utilize the FCU variant, the electronic variant of the Redline. Obviously, the Redline milsim and 7 milsim is not going to be compatible because no electronics, no FCU. It's just not going to work. What we have noticed in putting our Redline N7 FCU variant into this AK, all of the programming on that FCU is done via trigger bulls. Coincidentally, all of the programming that gets done onto the trigger board is all done with trigger pulls as well. What happens is when you are supplying power to both the FCU for the engine as well as the trigger board, any trigger pulls are going to be prioritized for programming the board and not the engine. So this is the only case where, and that's why the Spartan electronics is not going to be compatible mostly. The Redline N7, you will need to use the original trigger contacts as well as get an additional piece of FCU wire in order to do some additional programming to the Redline independent of the trigger board. So that is something that you will need to consider, something that you'll need to have in addition to whatever you are trying to adjust on your Redline N7 FCU. Something that has been noted in the manual, but it's something that we have not tested, is if you have a V3, you can use the Sparkle Labs Wolf HPA engine if you use custom wire harness. And that is something that PERUN has noted in their manual and has even given you a diagram as to how that's going to work and how that FCU wiring needs to be configured in order to utilize the HPA trigger board that they have. So I'm glad they've been doing their research and glad that they've been able to give you guys options as well. For some of my speedy boys or some of my milsim players, I also have a list of FCUs that are not going to be compatible. So what happens is you can get an engine, you can get an aftermarket FCU, and this is an aftermarket trigger board. Aftermarket FCUs are not going to read and register with the HPA PERUN Trigger Board. So if you're using like a Gorilla, a T238, or any other aftermarket FCU, it is not going to read and register with the HPA trigger board, and it's just not going to be compatible. You got to go back to the stock FCUs. But enough talking about the functionality and about the board itself. You guys want to know how to do the installation and what that's going to look like. So let's go with a top down to our tech bench. All right, guys, welcome to this portion of the video where we're going to be doing a very rudimentary installation of the PERUN trigger boards into their respective gearboxes. We got the V2 into a V2, V3 into a V3. So let's get into it. We're gonna start with the V2. So I'm gonna kick my V3 components off to the side here. And currently with this box, it is empty because I've already pre-removed a bunch of components. Inside of the box, you are going to have your playing card, which is going to feature a whole bunch of trigger adjustments for programmability. So when it comes to the PERUN HPA trigger board, as well as the hybrid, you do have a bunch of adjustable features. One of the first ones is going to be your fire mode or your selector position mode. What this is going to do is you do get all of the same base programmability of the FCU. The difference is that when it comes to the firing mode, you do have safe, you have semi-auto, but you also have binary as well as a 2-stage trigger option, which is very, very rare when it comes to anything that's going to be an HPA board. So the fact that we have something that does allow that is very, very cool. You can also adjust trigger sensitivity, and if I remember the manual correctly, you can adjust the sensitivity to recognize a shot with up to a 0.1 millimeter movement on the trigger, which is very, very, very sensitive, and that does allow for a lot of faster trigger action. You also have what is referred to as a DMR mode. Now this is going to limit how many shots you can fire per second or per duration. So in the case of DMR mode, you have it off. You have 1 shot for every quarter of a second, half of a second, 1 second, 2 seconds, and 3 seconds, to either mimic what an actual DMR is going to fire if you're taking accurate shots, or just limit how quickly you can spam the trigger, which is all right. And then you have a master reset. Now all of those are going to be separate from the FCU programmability. So very, very, very cool that we have something that does allow for all of that programmability. Makes it very, very custom. Speaking of custom, you do have a couple of sticker options as well. Some of the PERUN branded ones. Again, stickers for the different programmability options. And then you also have on the other side here a QR code that takes you directly to the manual. I cannot stress how much I would suggest having the manual open, reading through it before beginning installation process. Absolutely, absolutely have that up. You also have a cute little patch. You are going to have the board itself. You are going to have this little guy that is going to sit on the top of a trigger that I'll show you later. And then you also have a selector plate. Now on this selector plate is an additional magnet that is designed to go onto aftermarket or stock selector plates in case this guy does not fit. So I'm going to put those two pieces back together. So let's go through these steps of the installation process. Quite honestly, the easiest step is going to be taking your board and intersecting it like so. Very, very easy. I will note that you will need to install this part to be a little bit more than finger tight. Now what I do is as I screw this down, I apply pressure upwards on the very bottom here. This is going to do, in my opinion, interface the trigger board to be in the best lineup. So it's going to be parallel to the very front face of this trigger, as well as be most in line or parallel with how the cylinder is going to be faced. That did not make sense, but I said it and I'm going to stand by it. And what I'm doing is I'm going finger tight, so I don't want the board to move around freely. Compared to a regular trigger board, which you can kind of get away with a little bit of slop, because the entire engine is going to fire and recognize a shot when this button gets depressed by the trigger. That is not going to occur, so if you have a super high trigger sensitivity and this is sitting loosely, just the board moving back and forth could recognize when a shot occurs. So get that to be snug, but not tight. Okay. Then with our single solenoid jack, we're going to drop that guy into here, plug it into the J2, and then we have our long wire that's going to sit off to the side here, be all curly. We're going to plug our FCU wire into the FCU wire port. Next, we're going to plug the FCU in, and now this comes to the point where if anyone has done a HPA install, you're going to look at this and you're going to wonder why the heck you have 3 different JST plugs. So you're going to have 2 female and 1 male. What this does and what this allows is typically you're going to have a battery such as this guy, our little amped Airsoft HPA battery, that would power the FCU, go directly to the board and power via a little bit of ghost energy signal information to the board and to the engine. What this interface does instead is you have to have a battery that's going to power both the FCU and the board separately. So the 1 male plug is going to connect with the FCU, so that way you have your 1 female that is going to have the HPA board plug into. It's going to light up, give us a green light saying that it has power and everything is all good. Now, I will note and will mention that the board, while very simple in design, is also a little complicated. It is not going to recognize when a shot occurs. which is just fine. So now we're going to get to the actual component that would come in the box. So we have this little guy right here. Focus up. Now what this is going to do is you have 3 screws and you have a magnet on the inside of this guy. Come on, makeup. TikTok makeup. I should probably grab something that is non-magnetic. So you have 3 different screws. You're going to take these 2 top-facing screws and you're going to undo those. What that's going to allow you to do is, since I have another one pre-installed onto a trigger here, that is going to allow it to sit in interface with the trigger like so. And the magnets work very, very, very well. So if you're running just the trigger board, you're going to mount that to the top of your trigger, and that is going to be the magnet that interfaces with the trigger board and is going to recognize when a shot occurs. What is really cool with the PERUN system, you also have the clicker family. So I have here a clicker V2, V2 standing for the version 2 gearbox that this is going to work and interface with. You also have the speeder and the V2 Pro. They also make it for a version 3 gearbox that we're going to demonstrate and show off with the install of the V3 gearbox. Now for anyone that is interested in the clicker system, I have one on my M110 here. And what this is going to do is going to allow you to have a little bit more realistic of an action. So you do have a bunch of pre-travel before you hit a wall. A lot of airsofters, when it comes to an HPA install, are probably going to get to the wall and realize, when it's powered and there's air, that there's no shot. Well, you hit the wall and you have to break through and pass the wall, and then you can get back to the wall and produce shots like this. This is going to work more like a realistic action of trigger, and it's very, very tactile. So anyone that wants to bridge the gap between their airsoft hobby and something that's going to give them very, very high performance, that is going to bridge and intersect with the real firearm aspect just a little bit, are probably going to appreciate this, like I do. So I'm gonna, honestly, since these clickers have been coming out and I can adjust the amount of force and break, I'm gonna start installing these into a bunch of my builds, because big fan of gas blowbacks, if you guys don't know, just because I like that more realistic action. And you can use a aftermarket trigger such as this that is going to allow you to get some action and some movement. I should also note, when we're talking about these guys that are attaching to the top of the trigger, you do need a trigger that is going to have the top tang. And what I mean by that is you need a trigger that has, if I can get it to focus, makeup TikTok angle, there we go. So you need something that's going to have this tang that sticks out from the top of the trigger, because that's going to interface and allow the magnet bit to hold onto the top of the trigger. So specifically the G&G triggers are not going to work in conjunction with this system, but G&G gearboxes are a version 2 gearbox, so you can use aftermarket mil-spec triggers, curve face triggers, or any other aftermarket triggers, as long as they have that tang bit. So between the magnet on top of the trigger or introducing the clicker system, that's how that would work and interface. So very, very, very cool. The next bit that you have to worry about is going to be all of the additional wiring that sits on the inside of here. So either pressing it back in or running it to the back of the gearbox like I have with my M110. It does make it a little bit of a mess, so it can be a little difficult when trying to do different installs. But I'm going to very quickly try to unplug these. So I have the trigger, clicker, board, and engine as a demonstration. Right, and we're going to pretend that we have the wires coming out of the back here. We have our normal V2 selector plate. Kind of move this around. This is not going to work. We have to have either the selector plate that's going to come inside of the package, or we need to utilize this magnet in conjunction with the provided selector plate on the side of the gearbox. In the case of my M110 with a VFC style of gearbox, you will need to utilize this magnet system. And I'm going to try to force this up and out. There we go. The problem is not the fact that it doesn't work, because it does work. What is like a little bit odd is getting this started and going. And honestly, is a little bit better if you do this outside of the gearbox before you have the board installed. Come on now, there we go. Because this is a soft polymer, I'm thinking I can get away with it, which I may or may not. Come on. Okay, there we go. Now, in the case of, like I said, VFCs, with the selector switch, it is not going to interface with this selector plate. So you'll need to grab a normal V2 selector plate. That is a SCAR one, so I can't exactly use that. I'll just use this. So the magnet on the back side of this selector switch, or selector plate, excuse me. So the magnet on the other side of this selector plate is going to interface with some of the sensors on the board. What you're going to do is, with your polymer selector plate, in the manual, there is going to be an exact distance that you will need to measure from the very edge here in order to interface ideally with the back of the trigger board. They also suggest that you may need to take this off a couple of times before you actually nail down where it exactly is. So, in the case of a V2 gearbox, if you get it to about this position, that's going to be, I think, close enough. But if you're running something that is maybe a little bit more unique, that utilizes a V2 gearbox, but is not like a normal M4, you may have to do a little bit of experimentation. So keep that in mind. But otherwise, that is our total assembly when it comes to a V2 gearbox. Now, I'm going to take the rest of this back apart, and we're going to talk about the V3 installation. Now for the V3, again, kind of a down and dirty V3 gearbox. This one is from a E&L. Then we have our PERUN V3 trigger board, which also, again, is empty. I've already removed everything that we're going to be utilizing. We are going to be having a jack, same exact jack. We're going to pretend it's the correct nozzle length. But I do have the trigger board, FCU, as well as the wire harness that we would need for the V3 system. Now in the case of this guy, again, we're going to kick it off to the side because in the PERUN Trigger Board, we have our PERUN Trigger Board. We have a little magnet that's going to interface with our trigger action. We have this little doodad, which is for our selector plate. And we also have patch, programming card, which again, ace of spades, always has been the ace of spades, as well as our doodad of stickers. And once again, always suggest having the HPA Trigger Board manual pulled up so you can do that as a reference while you install this guy, because I'm only going to go so far when it comes to the installation instructions, and PERUN does a phenomenal job with iterating everything. So, really quickly, we're going to compare boards. So I've got this guy here, which is going to be our version 3 trigger board. Really, there's nothing that is any different from a normal trigger board. The difference is going to be how the version 3 is going to intersect and interact with the board as a whole. So our semi and auto, and then our semi and auto, so our select fire position, and then our actual trigger button. I just have those two things reversed. And then we have our PERUN HPA board, which has, as long as this can go and focus, come on, very similar as far as overall shape and profile, but there is a distinct lack of buttons that the trigger is going to interact with. And that is the point when it comes to PERUN. They're going to have optical as well as magnetic interfaces to recognize when a shot occurs and what selector position we are in. We also have all of the different plugs for battery, J2, J3, Wolverine, FCU, and then our Polar Star FCU. And then of course the long wire that is going to be our power source for our PERUN trigger board, as well as the FCU when we put all of those things together. The crazy additional parts components, I'm going to put the patch off to the side, is going to be this guy right here, is one of them. So on a normal V3 trigger system, we have the trigger, and then we have this little trolley, which is going to push the trigger contacts together and is going to create a shot. So they're going to sit together and they're going to create a movable action that sits right here. I'm going to see if I can do this without like looking directly down onto it, and that way you don't have to see my terrible hairline. There we go. So that's our trigger, and we move it back and forth. This component back here on the very back of my trigger, I kind of wish that the gearbox was something other than black, just so that the trigger and the hinge could stand out. You'll see that those two pieces are hinging. So every time this comes up, it's pushing the contacts together and it's completing an electrical circuit and creating a shot. What this piece does is it's the exact same thing, but it has a magnet on the very top of it. So every time the magnet gets close, it's going to recognize that there's going to be a shot that occurs. So the crazy part is that when you have a nice LCT or E&L AK, the trigger more than likely is going to be a magnetic. It attracts magnets. So you put that guy in, and then back and forth you are creating shots as it interfaces with our trigger board. Now, what we're going to do is we're actually getting ahead of ourselves. The other component here is going to be our selector plate tabs or inserts. What these are going to do is each one of these, so there's 3 separate components, even though it is machined as one. What you're going to do is you're going to cut along the dotted line along the very bottom. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow you to insert one of these tabs into the selector plate that's on the other side here. Inside of the manual for the V3 gearbox, I do suggest that you print it out because it's going to illustrate and it's going to be the exact same size as the trigger or the selector plate. So what you can do is when you have that final page printed out, take this selector plate out and just put it over the cutout that PERUN has provided on that page, and just put that selector plate that you have cut to the correct size and just glue it and interface it with the outline on the paper. I'm going to try to have a clip to illustrate what that looks like, because it actually made that whole process really easy. And when it comes to V3 AKs, each of those selector plates are going to be a slightly different spec and slightly different positions, and how it lines up inside the gearbox is going to be slightly different from one another. So it's not going to be a copy paste, put this tab into this selector plate position and then you're good to go. Each one is very different, and be aware of that. All right, so we're going to take this guy right here, interface it. This one is a little bit trickier when it comes to getting the correct position, and again, we don't want to have it wobbly, so I'm going to go snug and I'm going to try to line it up as closely as I can to be as parallel with the cylinder as possible. Yeah. Okay, cool. Bong, that's not going anywhere. And then what this allows us just to do is put our engine there, plug it into J2, and then we have our wire harness, which is going to plug into, you know, while I'm here, I might as well just do it for you guys. when it comes to V3 builds, make sure that your wire is plugged into place firmly. Don't be afraid to go on the edges and give it a good firm press in, because it is a little time consuming to get a V3 system all the way apart. And so when you put it all back together and something's not connected properly, you got to take it all the way back apart, make sure that those are connected and pressed firmly before you look at any other resolutions. So we have those three things plugged in: battery, solenoid wire, and our FCU wire. And then we're back to having 3 JST connectors. We know the drill. Plug the male into the female, and then we have our one interfacing, or our one female JST. So we can plug our HPA battery that is going to power both the FCU and the trigger board. And just like that, we've got it connected. And then what should happen, it lights up, it recognizes that the magnet is close by. And if you're wondering what the magenta and the red is doing, or what it represents, let's look at that. So trigger pull has been detected, and the selector is switched to auto. But what's happening is, even if I go and I shoot it, or at least move it as if I'm inducing a shot, nothing is going to occur, because it's just that smart. We can also utilize the PERUN Clicker V3. So even though they have a version for the V2, and they have a couple versions for the V2, they also have a clicker for the V3. Now they don't have a speeder or a pro. This is just going to be a normal V3 clicker. What you can do is you can adjust the brake as well as the pre-travel and over-travel of the entire system. So it is going to act just like a clicker is supposed to, which is very, very, very cool. And what this does is, oh, you can hear it shooting. So it does recognize when a shot occurs. So I'm going to try to put this into position. This does get a little weird because it is very tight in that position, but we can put our trigger into place, and we can go, we can go. There we go. We get that tactile action. And that is how the clicker is going to work and interface on the PERUN HPA Trigger Board. I'm going to quick unplug all of this, because I want to also show you and point out, because I did it on the previous board, but I didn't do it on this board, all the interfaces and doodads that are all around the board. So the very front, this is going to be all of our magnetic sensors. So that is going to be what the magnet waves over and recognizes when a shot occurs. On the very back, different from the version 2 trigger board, these are going to be an optical sensor. And those are going to be what are going to read the lines in the white coloration of the selector plate tabs or inserts for your system to recognize if it's in semi or automatic. And that is how that works. So just be very careful. It is actually not going to rub or interface against those diodes or those sensors, but just be very careful when you're doing that entire installation process. The V3 is going to be a little bit more exposed, have more components available rather than the V2. So that is our V3 installation compared to our V2 installation. And that is our full overview of the PERUN HPA trigger boards, as well as the installation video. Guys, if you have any further questions, put them down in the comments section below or send us a DM. We're always happy to answer any of your guys' questions, as well as maybe look at other videos that we can do for you guys in the near future. So look forward to seeing those. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day. Take care, stay safe, stay positive, and I will see you guys in the next one.